The moment I was still shaking, holding the stack of inheritance papers in my hands, the heavy wooden door of the lawyer's office swung open. Standing there were the two faces I'd longed for and resented for 15 years, my real parents. They walked in like time had never passed. My dad, Paul Coleman, gave me a stiff smile and reached out his hand, while my mom, Linda, wrapped me in a hug like she'd just found her lost child at a shopping mall. But my heart didn't move. It felt heavy, like someone had dropped a stone on it. Before I could react, lawyer Harold Monroe cleared his throat. The sound echoed through the dark wood-paneled room, tightening the air. My parents slowly sat down across from me, their smiles fading, replaced by a look of restless calculation. And me, Rachel Coleman, a 28-year-old woman who had just lost the only aunt who ever raised me, suddenly became a millionaire. Aunt Margaret Hayes had left me everything: the old mansion on the edge of Chicago, every share of her multi-million-dollar company, and even a pile of cash I still couldn't believe was real. Right then, I knew the family tragedy from years ago had never really ended. It was only starting a new chapter, one I had no choice but to face with the very people who abandoned me at 13. Before this story goes any further, I want you to know exactly who I am. My name's Rachel Coleman. I was born and raised in a small town in Illinois. I'm 28 now, but the memories of my childhood and the day my parents walked out still feel as fresh as yesterday. My childhood wasn't fancy, but it wasn't lacking either. My dad, Paul, was a sales manager at a local dealership. He used to have this big smile and a lively charm that could win anyone's trust the first time they met him. My mom, Linda, taught elementary school. She was patient, gentle, and loved by her students. We lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment in Springfield. It was tiny, but it was warm. I still remember the smell of microwave popcorn every Friday night when the three of us curled up on the old sofa to watch a movie. Our summer camping trips in that beat-up secondhand tent were some of my happiest memories. Midwest nights were cool, filled with the hum of crickets and the flicker of fireflies. Back then, I thought my family wasn't rich, but we were happy. But as I got older, the cracks started to show. I remember the muffled arguments behind the bedroom door, the secret phone calls my dad took in the hallway. He'd come home late, smelling more like cigarettes and liquor than car wash soap. My mom grew quieter, sometimes lying in bed all day with the curtains drawn tight. Still, I kept holding on to hope. I studied hard, did my chores, and tried not to cause trouble. I believed if I was good enough, things would go back to the way they were. Then one cold October morning, I woke up in an empty apartment. My parents were gone. No goodbye, no explanation. Just a single note with 16 words on it. That was the day my whole world changed. If I had to paint my childhood as a picture, it'd be a small apartment glowing with warm yellow light, an old sofa, and nights full of laughter. When I was little, I thought life was simple. As long as my parents were there, I'd always be safe. But when I was 11, maybe 12, the first crack started to show. I remember the whispers behind my parents' bedroom door. My mom's shaky voice, "Paul, you promised," and my dad snapping back, "I'll handle it. Stop worrying so much." I was too young to get it, but some part of me knew something was wrong. My dad loved playing poker with his friends. At first it was just weekend nights, a few bucks here and there. But then came the Atlantic City trips, and he'd come home heavy and distant, shutting us out. Once, I heard my mom crying in the kitchen, begging him to stop before he lost everything. He promised, but his promises were like loose change, rolling away the second they hit the floor. My mom changed too. Her constant smile faded. She kept calling in sick, some days not getting out of bed at all, the room heavy with darkness and a faint smell of pills. The fridge stayed empty. When I asked, she'd snap, "Just eat whatever's there, Rachel." I still remember sitting at the table with a nearly empty cereal box, pretending I wasn't hungry while my stomach growled. I was just a kid, but I felt like I had to hold the whole house together. I cleaned up, studied on my own, did the laundry, and above all, stayed quiet. I told myself if I was good enough, smart enough, they'd stop fighting. They'd stop slipping away. But that belief only lasted a few more months. The day they left is burned into me. It was an unusually cold October morning in Illinois. I woke up late. My mom didn't call me like she always did. The apartment was strangely silent. When I walked into their room, it felt like a punch to the chest. Half the closet empty. Drawers yanked open. Socks scattered across the floor. They were gone. On the kitchen table, a hastily folded note. My mom's handwriting. Rachel, we can't do this anymore. Aunt Margaret will take care of you. We're sorry. Just 16 words. 13 years of childhood packed into a cold little sentence. I called my mom. It rang and rang. No answer. I called my dad. A recorded voice said the number didn't exist anymore. I searched the address book for any clue, but all I found was emptiness. That night I slept on the sofa, hugging a pillow, ears straining for any sound outside, hoping they'd come back and knock on the door. By the second day, the landlord came by for late rent, staring at me with suspicion. I stammered that my parents were away. He just growled, "If you don't pay, I'll call social services." By the third day, the fear of being sent to an orphanage was so big, I couldn't stand it. I ran to the school office, found the counselor, and broke down. That was the first time I said it out loud. My parents had disappeared. That was the day my world fell apart. And me, a 13-year-old kid, officially became the one left behind. When I told the truth to the school counselor, I thought I'd be shipped off to some strange house, crowded with kids and full of hand-me-down everything. But luckily, the social worker who showed up was Ms. Dawson, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a voice as warm as a winter blanket. I still remember that afternoon. My little apartment was a mess, empty cereal boxes scattered all over the kitchen. I sat curled up on the sofa, hands shaking, when Ms. Dawson gently put her hand on my shoulder. "Rachel, you're not going through this alone. We'll find someone in your family." Those words felt like a lifeline in the middle of an ocean. Then she said a name that gave me both hope and fear. Margaret Hayes, my dad's older sister. I'd only met her twice in my life. She was strict, well-dressed, and had a way of looking right through you. I had no idea if she'd even want to take me in. But just a day later, the sound of a car engine echoed through the old neighborhood. I pulled back the curtain and saw a shiny black sedan stop right in front of my building. Out stepped a woman in a gray suit, a pearl necklace around her neck, her silver hair pinned tight. She didn't cry, didn't hug me like in the movies. She just said firmly, "Pack what you can carry. The rest will be sent later." I stuffed a few clothes, some books, and my torn family photo album into a bag. As I walked out of the apartment, I looked up at the ceiling one last time, where the glow and the dark stars from my childhood still clung. My heart was a knot of fear and the strange feeling of leaving one world for another. The 3-hour drive was silent. Aunt Margaret drove, occasionally asking short questions, "Need water?" or "Want to stop?" I kept my eyes on the window, watching endless rows of cornfields roll by, the sunset painting the horizon red. Everything familiar was shrinking in the rearview mirror, like my whole old life was fading away. The new house rose up like a castle, a Victorian mansion with steep roof lines, giant wooden windows, and an iron fence wrapped around it. When I stepped inside, the living room felt like a museum, shiny wooden floors, Persian rugs, and a carved wooden frame holding the portrait of a woman on the wall. That first night, I lay in a 4-poster bed with heavy curtains, feeling completely lost. No more familiar apartment noise, just the wind whistling through the window panes. I cried quietly, scared Aunt Margaret might one day vanish just like my parents. But the next morning, when I came down to the kitchen, she was already there. Newspaper in hand, coffee steaming on the table. She looked up, didn't smile, and said, "Breakfast is at 7. That's the first rule." Right then, I understood. My life would never be the same again. I'd been pulled out of the pit, but I was stepping into a world of rules I'd never known before. That very first morning at the Hayes Mansion, I knew my new life wasn't going to be easy. The grandfather clock struck 7 sharp, and Aunt Margaret was already sitting in the dining room. A long table covered with a white cloth, breakfast laid out with fried eggs, toast, and black coffee. When I tiptoed in a few minutes late, she glanced at her watch and said flatly, "You're late. Next time the kitchen closes at 7:30. If you miss it, you're on your own." My face burned. I couldn't say a word. That was the first rule. And I quickly realized there were plenty more. The bed had to be made before leaving the room, no shoes on the wooden floors, homework finished at the desk, not on the couch, and the most important one at dinner, you had to share one news story and one personal achievement from your day. At first, those rules felt like chains. I was a lost teenager, abandoned and confused, so of course I pushed back. I tested her, left candy wrappers on the counter, skipped my math homework and pretended I was too tired. Once, I even skipped school, wandering the mall until dark. But instead of exploding, Aunt Margaret handled each thing calmly, almost coldly, but always clear. Candy wrappers? I cleaned the kitchen for a week. Skipped homework? Weekend plans canceled until it was done. Skipped school? She just looked me straight in the eye and said, "You can try everything to get yourself kicked out. But I don't walk away from people. Rules exist to protect you, not to cage you." That line hit me hard. I didn't believe her right away, but somewhere inside, a tiny spark flickered. There were moments I'll never forget. One night, I found my parents' wedding photo and broke down sobbing in my room. I was terrified she'd scold me for being weak. But she just walked in quietly, handed me a linen handkerchief, and sat beside me. No lectures, just her presence, steady and silent, until I stopped crying. Another time, I bombed a math test even after studying all night. I shoved it deep in my bag, trembling. She found it, but didn't say a word of blame. The next day, a math tutor was waiting in the living room. Aunt Margaret simply said, "Being smart isn't enough. You need the right tools to use it." Those moments slowly loosened the tight knot in me. She never once said "I love you," but the way she showed up, the way she kept her word, was a kind of love I'd never known from my real parents. That mansion, which first felt like a museum, slowly turned into a different kind of school. I learned to play piano an hour a day, even if I was never going to be a musician. I learned proper table manners, how to make an argument instead of just complaining. I learned to take responsibility for every little thing I did. Of course, I still stumbled. There were nights I cried for my parents, feeling trapped inside her rules. But every morning, Aunt Margaret was still there, with her coffee and her paper, reminding me that even if the world fell apart, someone was keeping rhythm steady. Little by little, I realized her discipline wasn't meant to tie me down. It was laying the foundation for a kid who had lost everything. And within that strict structure, for the very first time, I felt safe. When I turned 15, Aunt Margaret made a big decision. She pulled me out of the local public school and enrolled me in one of the top private schools around Westfield Academy. Just hearing the tuition made my head spin. All she said was, "Education is the one investment that never loses value. You're going there." My first day on campus felt like landing on another planet. Red brick buildings, perfectly trimmed lawns, luxury cars lined up to drop kids off. And there I was, with a worn-out backpack and old sneakers, feeling completely out of place. My classmates chatted about vacations in Florida, lake houses in Michigan. I sat in the back, hiding my rough hands from housework. The assignments were harder than anything I'd ever faced. Night after night, I stayed up late, eyes burning. Some nights I'd collapse on my desk and whisper, "I don't belong here." But Aunt Margaret never showed sympathy. When I complained, she dropped a thick stack of notes in front of me and said, "Struggles aren't an excuse to quit. You have 2 choices. Use this chance to rise or bury yourself. I don't invest in quitters." Her words made me shake with anger. I felt more like a project than a child. But deep down, I knew she was right. So I joined study groups, used my allowance to pay classmates for tutoring, and climbed out of the hole bit by bit. By the end of the year, my name was on the honor roll. But the biggest clash between us came senior year when it was time to apply to college. I wanted the University of Illinois, where most of my friends were going. Aunt Margaret insisted on Northwestern, the University of Chicago, even the Ivy League. One night at dinner, I finally snapped. "I'm not your project. I want to choose my own life." She stayed calm. "And I never wanted to be anyone's guardian. But I was here. I gave you options your parents never had. Don't waste them just because you're scared." Then, in the silence that followed, she told me something she'd never shared before. About my father, a man who had a brilliant mind for math but couldn't go to college because of poverty. He chose the quicker path, gambling to get rich fast, and destroyed himself in the process. "I don't want you repeating that mistake," she said, her voice softer than usual. That story cut through my stubbornness. I cried quietly that night. And the next day, I filled in Northwestern on my application. The college opened up a whole new world. I fell in love with marketing and design, discovering I had a knack for building ideas. Summers, I interned at my aunt's company, learning how to read reports and negotiate with partners. I remember during one tense meeting, she leaned over and whispered, "Watch who speaks first, who backs down, who holds eye contact longer." Business is just human psychology played out at the table. And yes, I had my first love in those years too. His name was Mark, an engineering student, kind and genuine. But when I brought him home for Thanksgiving, Aunt Margaret's look said everything. After dinner, she pulled me aside and said, "Don't let short-term sweetness ruin your long-term path. You're just getting started." I was furious, felt like she was intruding way too far. But years later, when that relationship ended over distance and clashing ambitions, I realized she hadn't been wrong. After graduation, I finished with honors and officially became marketing director at her company. It was the start of a new chapter, more independent, but also more tied to the woman I once saw only as a warden. After I graduated and officially started working at the family company, something shifted between me and Aunt Margaret. Funny enough, the physical distance during my college years had actually brought us closer in spirit. Back when we lived under the same roof, every meal felt like a debate, every mistake got called out. I always felt like I was on stage under a spotlight being judged. But once I moved into the dorm, then later my own apartment near campus, the space between us made those Sunday phone calls feel like lifelines. At first, they were short, all about classes and work. But slowly, they softened. One time, I told her about my roommate leaving a pizza in the microwave until it set off the whole floor's alarm. She laughed. Just a short, raspy laugh, but so real it almost made me cry. When I moved back into the mansion after college, it no longer felt like a prison. For the first time, I walked into her grand library without fear, pulled a dusty marketing book off the shelf, and read it. She passed by, paused for a moment, then simply nodded. That tiny gesture warmed me more than any "I'm proud of you" ever could. At the company, I started taking on bigger responsibilities in the marketing department. Sitting in executive meetings, I saw Aunt Margaret in her truest form, sharp, relentless, always cutting straight to the point. At first, I just took notes. But one day, when a sales director pitched a ridiculously expensive campaign, I spoke up. The room went silent, waiting for her reaction. She fixed those cold eyes on me, then gave the smallest nod. "That's reasonable. We'll go with Rachel's proposal." In that moment, I was both terrified and proud. I wasn't just the taken-in niece anymore. I was a real partner. Of course, we still clashed. She nitpicked everything from how I dressed for meetings to how I worded client emails. Once, I snapped back. "You can't control every part of my life." She stayed calm. "I'm not controlling you. I'm preparing you for the world out there." Beneath her tough words, I started to see the fear she carried. The fear that I'd repeat my parents' mistakes. And sometimes, that hard shell cracked. One winter night, with snow covering the garden, I found her in the living room holding an old photo of my grandfather and my dad. For the first time, she told me about their poor childhood. How my dad had been brilliant, but had to quit school to work. Her voice caught when she said, Paul always felt cheated out of his chance. Maybe that's why he gambled. I don't want you living with that kind of regret. Hearing her, I saw a different woman. Not the cold warden, but a grieving sister who had watched her brother throw his life away. From that day on, I looked at Aunt Margaret differently. I still feared her strictness, but I also recognized the love behind it. Our bond never turned into some perfect mother-daughter relationship. Instead, it became something real, something solid, a respect built on the fact that she never abandoned me, even when I messed up. And it was that foundation that prepared me for the hardest test of my life. A test no business lesson could ever teach, watching the only family I had left slip away to an illness no one could stop. The bad news came one autumn afternoon as yellow leaves scattered across the mansion's yard. Aunt Margaret had just come back from the hospital, a white envelope in her hand. I saw the truth in her eyes even before she spoke the words pancreatic cancer, final stage. I remember breaking down in tears while she forced a brittle smile. We all leave someday, Rachel. The only difference is when and how we use the time we have left. She kept working almost until the end. Meetings in the living room now came with an oxygen tank beside her chair. I became her right hand, learning how to sign contracts, handle staff, even keep calm when everything was chaos. But at the same time, I was also the one sorting her meds, checking appointments, pushing her to eat when she wanted to skip meals. Our roles flipped. I became the watcher, and she was the one sneaking out of rules. Some nights, I couldn't hold it in. I'd sit in the hallway sobbing, terrified of losing the only person who ever stayed by my side. Once, as I helped her up the stairs, she stopped, squeezed my hand with what little strength she had left, and whispered, "Rachel, you're the daughter I never let myself have. Taking you in was the best decision of my life." I froze. In 15 years, she had never called me daughter. And now, through labored breath, she gave me that word as her final gift. The last months, the house grew strangely quiet. She no longer read the paper in the garden, no longer stayed up late in her study. Instead, we flipped through old photo albums together. I was stunned to see she'd kept every certificate I'd ever won, even a tiny newspaper clipping about my high school speech contest. She didn't say much, just ran her hand gently across the pages, her eyes holding a love words could never capture. The morning she passed was a silent winter morning. Snow blanketed the garden, the sky heavy and gray. I walked into her room and found her lying still, her face peaceful, as if she was only asleep. I sat beside her, held her cold hand, and whispered, "You did more than any mother ever could." The funeral was simple, just as she wished. No show, no excess. A few close colleagues, some old friends, and me, the only one who called her family. Standing by her fresh grave, the cold wind cut straight into me. But beneath the grief, there was gratitude. I had been loved, not with sweetness, but with steadiness and devotion. When I returned to the empty mansion, my footsteps echoed through the hallways. For a second, I thought I heard her cane tapping against the wooden floor, then realized it was only silence. And in that silence, I knew the next test was waiting, one called inheritance, legacy, and the return of a past I thought I had buried. 3 weeks after Aunt Margaret's funeral, I got a letter from lawyer Harold Monroe's office. It was short. The will reading will take place Tuesday at 10 a.m. I'd already braced myself, thinking some of her estate might go to longtime employees or charities. But when I walked into that wood-paneled room, I never expected to face the darkest part of my past. The moment the door opened, I saw them. Paul and Linda Coleman, my birth parents. The man who used to overflow with energy now hunched over, gray streaks through his hair, his face weathered by time. The woman who'd once been gentle now looked thin, her eyes sunken, makeup clumsy over her tiredness. They smiled at me weakly, like the last 15 years had been nothing but a nap. "Rachel," my dad rasped, "my girl, you've grown so much." My mom didn't wait. She threw her arms around me, her cheap perfume choking me up. I stood stiff, my heart pounding not from emotion, but from a surge of anger rising inside me. Before anything could be said, Monroe cleared his throat and opened a thick folder. He read the will out loud. The entire mansion, the multi-million-dollar company, investments, bank accounts, everything left to me. I went numb. I'd known Aunt Margaret was wealthy, but I'd never imagined the scale. I hadn't even caught my breath when my mom grabbed my hand, her voice syrupy sweet. "Sweetheart, this is such a big responsibility. Luckily, you still have your parents here to guide you," my dad added, trying to sound calm. "Legally, we're still your guardians. We can help you manage all this until you're ready." I was speechless. 15 years of abandonment, and now they'd come back wearing the title parents to grab control of the estate. Thankfully, Monroe stepped in. "I'm afraid there's some confusion. There are papers I'll present tomorrow to clarify." I exhaled, but inside I was shaking. After the reading, my parents invited me to dinner. I should have refused, but a part of me, the 13-year-old still inside, still craved an explanation. We met at an upscale Italian restaurant downtown. They were already seated, a bottle of red wine open. My mom was more carefully made up, my dad in a new shirt that still couldn't hide his belly. They started with small talk: my studies, my work, my friends. I gave short answers, waiting for the real reason. Finally, my mom took my hand, eyes glistening. "We owe you an explanation. Back then, your dad was drowning in gambling debt, and I was depressed. We thought you'd be better off with Aunt Margaret. We were ashamed. We couldn't come back." My dad bowed his head, adding, "I've been clean from gambling for 8 years now. We've built a modest life in Arizona. Not a day goes by we don't think of you." I choked up. Part of me wanted to believe. But then came the next line, revealing everything. "Sweetheart," my mom said, "we just need a little help. The house in Phoenix still has a $70,000 mortgage. Your dad's medical bills are another 30. If you could help, we could start fresh." I set my glass down, my voice ice cold. "So $100,000 makes up for 15 years? What about the nights I waited for the phone to ring? What about the birthdays no one showed up for? What's the price tag on those?" My mom burst into tears. My dad squeezed her hand, trying to salvage it. "Don't misunderstand. We just want a fresh start, but if you could also bring us into the company, put us on payroll, then." I cut him off. "You don't want me. You want money. You want status." That night, I went home in a storm of emotions. I'd just gotten what I thought. I always wanted my parents back, but it all felt like a transaction. The next day, we returned to Monroe's office. This time he had a massive file and a sealed letter from Aunt Margaret. My hands shook as I opened it, her familiar handwriting staring back at me. "My dear Rachel, if you're reading this, it means your parents have come back." I was ready for this. Over the years, they've come to me for money, even faked illnesses to exploit me. I hired investigators and have full proof. But the most important thing, since you were 16, I legally adopted you. You're my daughter, on paper and in my heart. No one can touch what I've left you." I read it out loud, each word like a blade. My dad went pale, my mom stammered, but Monroe laid the evidence on the table: photos, receipts, recordings. Proof they'd tried to extort Aunt Margaret over and over. My dad shot up, furious. "You stole my daughter." I looked him straight in the eyes and said slowly, "No. You left me. Aunt Margaret did what you couldn't, she stayed." The tension was so thick Monroe had to call security to escort them out. My mom twisted around, hissing, "You'll regret it, when all you have is money and no family." My throat tightened, but I answered. I had a family. Her name was Margaret Hayes. When the door slammed, I collapsed into a chair, tears pouring down. Not because I'd lost my parents again, but because I finally knew the truth: they'd never come back out of love, only out of greed. And Aunt Margaret, even after death, had protected me one last time. 6 months had passed since that final showdown with my birth parents, and Aunt Margaret's mansion slowly began to carry my own breath of life. I painted a few rooms, hung some art I loved, but I kept the long dining table, the one where we used to talk every night. That's where I often sat alone, remembering her voice firm, steady, unshakable. The company kept growing under my watch. I pushed new online marketing strategies, opened 2 more stores. Many of the employees had once worked for Aunt Margaret, and over time, they stopped seeing me as just the girl who inherited and started treating me like a real leader. Sometimes they'd say, "Rachel, you've got the same determined eyes as Margaret." And when I heard that, I'd smile, feeling like she was still here somehow. The most meaningful thing I did was start the Margaret Hayes Foundation, using part of the fortune to help kids who'd been abandoned. I met faces so young, with eyes full of the same fear I had at 13. A little girl named Emily once asked me, "Do you think someone will really stay with me?" I choked up, then held her tight.
Yes.
And sometimes it's not your birth parents. Sometimes it's the people who choose to love and protect you. One evening, while cleaning out Aunt Margaret's old bedroom, I found a small wooden box on her dresser. Inside were all the keepsakes, my certificates, photos, even a program from my college graduation. At the bottom was a handwritten letter. "Rachel, I was never good at saying tender words. But I love you not out of duty, but because you've been the greatest joy of my life. I want the world to know you're my daughter by law and by heart. Be well, be wise, be happy."
Mom.
That word mom broke me wide open. My whole life, I'd waited to hear someone call me their child. And in the end, it wasn't my birth parents. It was the one who chose to stay. The next week, I brought flowers to the cemetery. Beneath the name Margaret Hayes, I had one word carved: Mother. Standing at her grave, I finally understood the truth I'd been searching for all my life. Family isn't about blood. Family is the people who choose to stay, who choose to love, and who prove it through their actions every single day. And if you're listening to my story right now, I want to ask you, do you believe blood ties automatically deserve forgiveness? Or do you believe family has to be built on sacrifice and steadfast love? If my story touched you, share it. Let it be a reminder that sometimes real family doesn't come from where we were born, but from the ones who chose to stay.